Hey guys, welcome to Hunters EU Fan TV. Today we're going to be looking at some Winston gameplay from the Chengdu Hunters. Mainly we're going to be focusing on the strange situation fans saw during the Countdown Cup, where Elsa, who is primarily known for his diva play, took up the main tank role against London Spitfire. Yet, in the following match, ATing took on the main tank role against the Hangzhou Spark. Firstly, we'll have a quick recap of how the Hunters performed in the Countdown Cup. The Hunters started off with high expectations, coming in on the number 2 seed behind the Shanghai Dragons, after going 3-0 in their qualifiers. A lot of this success relied on the Hunters' aggressive Wrecking Ball Zarya dive, which was flourishing in the hero pools of the qualifiers. Coming into the tournament, however, Orisa was back in play, which put limits on the composition that Chengdu had found success with. The first match, as number 2 seed in APAC, was against the lowest ranked team in the cup, the London Spitfire, who have yet to really find an identity or lasting success with their rookie squad. The first map, Lijiang Tower, inspired some hope for the Hunters fans, as aiming on the Wrecking Ball and Jinmu's wide hero pool rolled the control round. But the Wrecking Ball wasn't going to last. London's dive comp favoured vertical maps, so they chose Numbani, where Winston rules king. Even with Elsa taking up the main tank role, the Hunters handily dispatched of the rookies. This pushed them onto the semi-finals, where they came up against the Hangzhou Spark, who had reverse swept Seoul in the opening round, after reverting to a dive comp that utilised Gushui's beastly Winston. Lijiang was the opening map again, but the Hunters couldn't replicate their success, largely owing to a failure to adapt to Hangzhou's compositional changes. This meant it was the Hunters' map pick, and after finding success on Numbani 24 hours earlier, Chengdu looked like they were ready to get straight back at the Spark. Only this time, with ATing playing the Winston. It's fair to say he's had middling success on the hero in Overwatch League so far, being subbed in earlier in the season to play Winston when Wrecking Ball couldn't cut the mustard. But despite a win on Volskaya, a map that plays into Hunters' pokey comforts, the Hunters were stopped by the Spark, rallied by Gushui's Winston. What I'm going to break down today is the difference in style between Elsa and ATing's Winston play, the effects of this, and whether the Hunters should have changed their keys to successfully beating the Spitfire. To do this, I'll detail the Numbani maps that the two tanks played in, on defense. First up, Elsa. So let's look at first point defense on Numbani, Chengdu against London, Elsa on Winston. Elsa is set up here on the right side high ground by the stairway, Jinmu is over here supporting him, and the Hunters are playing a poker composition with Jinmu on the Genji and Leave on the Ashe, which allows this nice crossfire between Elsa's position and the majority of the Hunters team, including Leave on this mid to long range damage hero. So this position is great because Elsa can scout this stairway to the high ground and start to deal damage if London want to access the high ground this way. It actually makes it very difficult for any of the Spitfire members to access this high ground, which means that they're forced onto this low ground here to initiate the dive. And we'll see that Elsa actually uses this position, forcing them to come round onto this low ground, and then initiates onto them here. So it allows this situation, where Elsa is putting pressure onto Bernard and the supports, but still has his jump cooldown in hand, you can see in the bottom right, and all of his cooldowns in hand. So having this jump cooldown in hand is really key to Elsa's playstyle. He uses this to maximize the pressure that he's outputting and then return to his team, which uses the space to output damage as well. So this is whilst Spitfire are initiating their dive, and Elsa actually manages to put pressure on Bernard and the supports and stop a lot of the support coming through to JMac and the other offensive members of the Spitfire. Now, Bernard here isn't the best target to be zapping with no follow-up damage, because the Tesla cannon is easily out-healed by just a brig, and it allows for instance, highly on the Anna to output healing onto the main front line of the Spitfire. On top of this, Zarya's can actually really hold their ground against a Winston just by using their personal bubble and outputting damage onto the Winston's bubble as well. The bubble also doesn't affect her allied bubble, which means that he's not actually shutting off any of Banar's utility in this fight. But Elsa consistently tries this throughout the whole series, putting this pressure on Banar. And Banar being under pressure, being with his backline, actually means that Elsa is just surviving here against half of the Spitfire's team, buying space for the Hunters. And you'll see actually how he uses his bubble in this situation as well, is just to maximize this pressure that he's putting onto the backline. He actually uses his bubble in the same way that you might use D.Va Defense Matrix, in the sense that he engages onto key targets and then maximizes the pressure that he's outputting just by surviving in that space. And the bubble is used as a survival tool, similar to D.Va Defense Matrix, and then uses the jump cooldown that he's got in a hand to return to his team. And you'll see him do this time and time again. He actually initiates from the high ground with his jump cooldown in hand and then returns back to the high ground for safety. So he initiates from here down to the low ground to output some damage and then back to the high ground. That's why having the high ground controlled by the stairway is really key. So we'll see through this fight how many times Elsa actually decides to jump down from this high ground. Now, Spitfire actually do win this fight because there's just too much point pressure, which means that the Hunters aren't coordinated enough to support their own dives, and there are picks onto Leave and Jinmu quite early. But Elsa's already went down onto the point and then come back out to the top. Now you can see here that he's actually getting quite low on health, and he decides to retreat back to his team to initiate from a different position. And we'll see why this is really important in a second. Because he allows this dive here. You see how much health he's got? He was on half of that health just a second ago on the high ground. So he retreats to get some heals and then takes this position here, which is really key because you can see that London Spitfire are really close to capping the point. And they have Nanoblade. If they manage to cap this point without using any ultimates, they've got such an ultimate advantage going to the second point, they'd probably snowball it within 1 or 2 fights. So putting this pressure here is really important. And also, the space that he takes with this bubble is really key, because Kyo actually clutches this fight. They do lose this fight, but Kyo manages to force out so much from the Spitfire here. By getting the sleep onto JMac, you can see that JMac is sleeping. And also, by Elsa staying in this position, he's actually in perfect line of sight of Kyo when Kyo wants to move out. So Kyo actually comes round the corner here, outside of the, within the bubble, and he's in line of sight of Elsa here. If Elsa is playing closer to the corner, for example, where Late Young is, or if he decides to come off the point to apply some pressure to Banar, this fight is easily lost by the Hunters. So you can see what happens here is that Kyo gets the sleep onto JMac, comes out and applies the nano to Elsa. This forces out a bunch of cooldowns from Spitfire, but also in this fight, because of his position on the cart, Spitfire actually have to initiate with Nanoblade to take the point, which was already at 99%. And Hunters had players coming back from spawn. So this should have been an easily won fight from the Spitfire, but because of this position with this long sightline that Elsa takes up, they're actually managing to force out ultimates. That means that Spitfire won't have them for the second point defense. And this second point setup by Chengdu, which is allowed for by that first point play, is one of my favorite sections of the series. It all starts by Elsa jumping to this high ground here, and you can see JMac wanting to work up here as well. JMac has already committed his cooldowns to access this high ground. Now, Elsa is able to take advantage of this space because of the defender's advantage along this sight line to this room. You've got all of this high ground where Kyo can be set up and Leave can be set up, that comes around the back here, that can view this room, which means that Elsa is going to have an innate advantage in this position. Now, for Spitfire to access this room, they need to commit cooldowns, and they actually don't have the line of sight into this room. So Elsa just being present up here means that we'll see that JMac actually sees Elsa and then decides to back down, back onto the point. So he retreats. And Elsa uses this position here, and the Hunters use this position here to find an even better one. So they initiate from this high ground that Elsa has just won with the Bob to take this corner, All right. Now this is really key. It puts a ton of pressure onto Bernard and the backline alongside the Bob, and it wins this position here. We'll see here. So Bob's controlling this corner, and once Bob is gone, Elsa actually controls this corner. Because at this point, Elsa is actually able to zap any of the London Spitfire members who want to move past here to help JMac's dive, which means that JMac is essentially working by himself in this fight. You can see Elsa coming out here to apply some pressure and to let them know that he's there, and then backing around back into the corner and using his jump cooldowns. Now this again sets up the sort of crossfire that we saw on the first point, in the sense that Leave also, at some point in this fight, takes up the high ground that Elsa won before. You can see Leave actually moving over here at this point. Leave is accessing this high ground, and you've also got another crossfire with Jinmu and Kyo over here. So controlling this sort of three-way crossfire, with Elsa putting pressure on the backline and Jinmu and Kyo able to output heals and damage, not giving a real viable singular target for JMac to dive because he's getting no support from his back because of Elsa's position. You can see how Elsa actually uses this corner just to continue backing out. He commits the Primal Rage here and retreats back into this corner where it's safe, where he's able to break line of sight with the London Spitfire members, and it actually forces out ultimates of the Spitfire as well. In this fight they use both EMP and Graviton Surge, and the Hunters use just a Naked Blade and the Primal. JMac has also committed the Primal, and they also use Rally on this point as well, which means even though they lose members like Late Young here, they're able to actually hold off for a bunch more time as well. So they manage to get this kill onto Bernard, and Elsa retreats to the corner. Now it's not a position that can be held for a long time anymore because Late Young has fallen. But you'll see how they actually manage to skirt this. So Elsa applies a ton of pressure, takes a ton of damage, and Late Young is still coming back, has just returned to the fight. And they use this point to retreat. Now Elsa gets low here, gets down to less than 100 health on this retreat. So you can see here he's on 85 health, and the Hunters have backed all the way across the street phase. Elsa retreats really importantly. So we saw how he used his jump cooldown defensively to return back to his team. Having the jump cooldown here, because of the space that he's taken before, he's not actually engaging with the jump cooldown, which means that he's able to back out with the jump cooldown. And that's really important here. We saw how in the first point they forced ults out because Elsa returned to his team and took line of advantage space. He's on less than 100 health here when he returns, and look what they're able to do. So they forced out Rally, and the Spitfire actually commit Nanoblade again in this fight. And they there's an early pick-off on Babel, which is really key, but the Spitfire's cooldowns and ultimates managed to pick out both supports from the Hunters and also they managed to pick off Elsa. But what Elsa's done by returning to his team is forced cooldowns and damage onto him, which allows the space for Leave to actually get a key pick off on Although. And Although going down, and if you look at JMac having to return to his team, not being able to be aggressive because he's taken a ton of damage to initiate, is that Hunters are actually able, despite the Spitfire putting 3 ultimates into that fight, and the Hunters only using Bob, they're actually able to hold this point off for the next fight. So we see Elsa's style here being really key. They're able to play defensively, they're able to force out ults and take space just by where Elsa is positioned on the map and by where he engages from. So he's not engaging from angles where he needs to use his jump cooldown, he's saving that so that he can output maximum pressure within the fight and draw out the maximum amount of cooldowns from the Spitfire, which means that the Hunters have the space, the cooldown management advantage, and the line of sight advantage to actually take out key fights. And you have to see how much Spitfire are actually using their ultimates, how much they have to commit to even get points that really the Hunters hold well, although they do lose the first 2 points, but they hold on third as well. Admittedly, this was against a London side that looks kind of lost. They are focused on ultimate combos, which they're not using to win fights, and they're playing very split. You can see a very clear split between their front line and their back line, which Elsa is getting in between and drawing out a ton of space. But Elsa's ability to set up engagement from the passive positions, like on first point and the corner with the mini pack on second point, means he's not using his jump to engage, and really sets up a lot of options for Chengdu to take this map and this series. Now we're with ATing on Winston. This is Chengdu versus the Hangzhou Spark. Numbani first point defense again. Chengdu are playing a different style this time, playing a more aggressive flanky dive with Jinmu on the Sombra and Leave on the Tracer. So we haven't got the crossfires and the long range poke that the Hunters had against the Spitfire. Now, they actually ran this on 0.3 defense against London because it's hard to set up crossfires and long range poke on that point. They decided to run up first point here, and they actually run this throughout the series. And this means that they don't have the same damage on the opposing dive that the Genji and the Ashe can output. It's a more aggressive style where you want to hit their backline. So we already see a more aggressive style just compositionally from the Hunters. And ATing is set up on this right hand side, high ground again. So you see the Spark back into the thing. ATing decides to drop down here and apply some pressure onto Architect. And gets some small damage onto Architect's Genji alongside Jinmu. However, do you remember when we praised the position at the top because it allowed Elsa to output damage and stop attackers coming through the stairway? That's exactly where the Hangzhou Spark go. Once ATing drops, they push through the stairs, get access to this high ground. And also it means that ATing is having to initiate with his jump. He doesn't have his jump cooldown here anymore to retreat. So whereas we saw Elsa initiate from the higher ground and then retreat back to higher ground with the jumps, it's happening the opposite way with ATing. He's initiating from the low ground, and to be safe, because he's not able to take the higher ground space, he has to drop back down. And we see that time and time again on this point actually. So he jumps up, puts some pressure up, he's unable to sustain here for very long, so he backs down again once Gushui comes through. He waits for his jump cooldown to come back up, takes some of the high ground, is booped down. We see him move some more, apply some pressure onto the back line, but he's still on the low ground, and the Gushui is able to initiate in the same positions as Elsa from the high ground to the low ground. And we see here he jumps back up to the high ground and drops again. And in this time Gushui has actually managed to pick off Kyo, because Kyo's had to rotate, and Gushui comes in with a counter dive to ATing that is able to pick off Kyo, which is a huge miss in this comp. It's the majority of the healing. So Hunters actually lose first point. Spark are a better team, they're far more coordinated. But we see ATing initiate from the low positions to the high ground. And what this means is that Leave can't actually follow ATing to these positions. Leave is unable to support his Winston on this aggressive dive, which means that the Hunter's composition is failing against the Spark, who have the high ground and can initiate with Architect onto the high ground and Gushui. So you see them back out and retreat, and they lose first point without really getting a ton done and forcing out anything from Spark other than the nano boost, which is built up really fast in this style of play anyway. So point B defense, you might want to hold the same corner, but Gushui ATing backs out really far. They need to wait for Jinmu, who's just got killed really late on in the fight, to come back. So it's fair enough that they can't initiate from the corner that they want to. But ATing also doesn't take this space that Elsa did on this high ground, where you have the advantage. You actually see Gushui and Architect set themselves up here on the high ground. So this is the high ground that Elsa jumped to at the beginning of their point B defense. And you can see that Gushui and Architect have already taken control of this space. So we'll see how they defend point B. So you see how far back ATing actually has to jump because of the late pick on Jinmu and because the space was lost on the high ground that Elsa took in the first point. And you see Sashin actually move up there now. The Spark have such an aggressive position and they're able to get so much cart push just because this high ground is being taken by the Spark and the Hunters aren't able to actually apply up there. On top of that, we actually see ATing initiating from the low ground time and time again. He uses his jumps from low ground to low ground here. Onto the supports, uses his bubble as he lands, and this is a really important fight for the Hunters. You actually see Jinmu uses EMP, which connects onto 3 members of the Spark, including Sashin, which is really important because it takes away all of his shields, moves him down to a 200 HP target. This is where your defense needs to come in. You've taken out 3 ultimates from the game, and you've got the biggest tank to take down at half health. You really need to follow this up. They've used Nano Boost onto ATing here. This really needs to result in a kill, but it doesn't. I think actually ATing loses a ton of time and space by coming around this side of the cart rather than the other side. He's already used his bubble and got it down on this corner. If he comes around the other side, he actually manages to get more people, and including Sashin, which is the important point. Sashin is able to get healed up here, back up to more than half health. They do pick off Mika by committing another ult, but that's not enough for this fight. It was a big EMP, you had 3 ultimates out of the game, you really needed to pick off Sashin. And this was position that ATing was in, and Sashin was over here. He comes round through the side to put pressure onto the back line, but it's not enough. This is the line of sight where Hunters need to control the space along this side here, and it's just not being taken. Now Spark are playing really well on this point, but even then, if we look at what happens next, it's poor. He initiates again, solo dives onto Bebe. So Gushui has just taken out Leave, he solo dives onto Bebe. This has got to be a really big point. And he actually commits Primal Rage really early on this dive as well. Sorry. Gushui is Primal Raging, and ATing actually ends up using Primal Rage to try and finish this kill onto Bebe. And we see how aggressive ATing is playing in comparison to Elsa. This is a solo dive onto Bebe. He's going for this kill. He's using his bubble as he lands. He's using all of his mechanics and his engagement tools to take out this single target. And he also commits his ult to try and take out this target. But all of his team has already been Graviton Surged, and they're already dead. He's the only player that's actually alive and able to do anything, and he commits his Primal Rage, which is a big mistake. We're not going to focus on it too much. players do these sorts of horrendous primal rages, and you've just wasted the ultimate after your entire team is dead. We see it time and time again. He actually ends up feeding 1000 ult charge here as well. But we see the style that ATing wants to play, which is this aggressive dive, isolating and dueling single targets. There's not enough follow-up from the Hunters with him, but also his looser style causes a lot of issues in terms of the space that the Spark are able to take against the Hunters. He's not able to initiate and take space, he's trying to take targets. The Spark play around this really well and take second point. So ATing's looser style seems to work better on point 3. Guxue is unable to maneuver the high ground away from him, and ATing clears up a number of fights. So you can see here that he takes advantage of the EMP, picks off Sashin, and gets a lot of damage onto Architect and pushes this fight out. Late Young uses his time to build up the Graviton Surge as well, and you can see Leave initiate here onto the supports, and ATing comes out and clears up a number of kills. So a really good fight from ATing here, but what's notable is that he's usually engaging after another member of his team is initiating. He's waiting for the EMP to come through. He's waiting for Leave to get a big damage against the supports, and he's coming through and he's clearing up a lot here. And again, in this position on the next fight, he's actually cleaning up after Late Young's Grav. So he's working as a secondary source of damage, cleaving from Late Young's Grav, playing aggressive, and cleaning up the supports alongside Leave. This is where ATing's style seems to fit better than Elsa's. It works as a secondary role, and this is where ATing actually seems best, is when he's in this secondary role and he's not having to create space in the neutral fight, in the mid fight against the Spark, but he picks up on the pace of others, and Hunters actually managed to trade out a lot of their own ultimates here. Late Young has now used 2 Gravs in the space that Sashin has held his. Spark here go through a number of eco pushes, and ATing cleans up on these dives. So this is where ATing's aggressive style fits. This is where maybe the Hunters were wanting to try on first and second point, but they couldn't manage it because ATing is unable to create the same space that the comp Hunters were running against London Spitfire allowed Elsa to do. It is always harder to look better when you're on the losing side and against a better team on the Hangzhou Spark. But we saw a number of stylistic differences between Elsa and ATing, particularly in the jump management and the space management. Elsa uses his jump to initiate from high grounds to take space. ATing uses his jump management to initiate from low grounds to try and finish off damage and create kills and create space that way. In conclusion, as you can probably tell from the analysis, I don't think ATing was up to scratch against the Spark, but it has to be said that Hangzhou looked far more coordinated than the London Spitfire, better practiced, with an understanding of how to punish the Hunters' loose dive. The Hunters' coaching team had obviously saw something that meant they favoured the flank dive with the Sombra and the Tracer against the crossfire poke that they had mastered going up against the Spitfire and in the qualifiers. Therefore, ATing's looser Winston play may have been wanted to create space for Leave and Jinmu to carry. This was the win condition that led them to winning Volskaya after all. Now, Elsa clearly has areas to work on with his Winston play. His bubble management to isolate key opponents, and mid-fight coordination. Elsa seemed to be playing in isolation at times. But his passive presence, taking space and getting value from where he's placed on the map, and his reserved jump use really paid dividends against the Spitfire, and shows that, with some work, he can be the pocket Winston that Chengdu deserves, but hopefully doesn't need right now. And remember, as always guys, let's go hunt.